hello, welcome to this webinar. My name is John Coldham and I'm Head of Brands and Designs here at Gowling WLG. Thank you for joining us. The question most companies find themselves being asked at the moment, be that by their employees, regulators, shareholders, customers, or even business partners, is, are you doing your bit to help the environment? And the good news is that many companies are indeed trying to work towards a more sustainable way of doing business. Some more actively than others, it has to be said, but there is no doubt that the push towards being environmentally responsible is only going to increase. The clamour for everyone, companies included, to do the right thing is getting louder and louder as the urgency for action to be taken grows more acute. Many companies have responded to this question by trying to demonstrate how they are growing more sustainable, be that through information on their websites or corporate materials, or through promoting the steps they're taking more actively with advertising and marketing. The danger for companies in this position is how far to go. Spend more time and money claiming to be green than actually implementing business practices that enable you to actually be green, and you might face accusations of greenwashing. This affects every industry, and I'm pleased to say that I'm joined by my colleagues, Dan Smith and Kate Hawkins, to guide you through this topical issue, and they advise on this day in, day out. Dan is our Head of Advertising and Marketing Law, and Kate Hawkins is a Senior Associate in our team who works very closely with Dan. Now, if you have any questions as we're going along, please do pop them into the Q&A box and we'll try to answer them at the end. We will have allowed some time for questions, but if we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you afterwards. Now, my role here is to make sure the slides work, so wish me luck as I transfer over, and otherwise I will hand over to Dan.
Okay, hello everyone. So this is not a new issue. I remember doing a talk almost 15 years ago now, featuring an oil company ad showing a power station spewing out flowers instead of emissions. That ad and the complaint which followed it had many of the same elements we see in green claims issues today. A basis in truth. So the company was using some waste carbon dioxide to grow flowers. A marketing team that then overreached, using language that could imply that all waste carbon dioxide was used in that way. And a campaigning group scrutinizing that ad, alleging greenwash and complaining to the regulators. So it's not a new thing, but it is a uniquely sensitive area. So with the COP26 summit in Glasgow, climate concerns have never been closer to the forefront of so many people's minds. And as concerns grow, the evidence shows that some people out there, at least, are prepared to pay extra for products and services with stronger green credentials, or which cause less harm. Businesses want to attract those customers, while at the same time feeling under pressure more generally to tell a story about how they're reducing their environmental impact. And that's led to a wealth of environmental claims across all media, from web pages under the heading of sustainability for a consumer or a business audience, to on-pack messaging about recycling, TV ads making carbon neutral claims, etc., etc. Green claims have never been more widespread. I'm seeing that in the work that comes across my desk. So taking just one industry as an example of that, the car ads we used to see were all about speed and power. Now they're all about zero emissions. They're about electric vehicle claims, range, charging, those kind of issues. And we're also seeing it with the regulators. So during the pandemic, the Advertising Standards Authority, the ASA, had to prioritize its workload. And the number of rulings was down across a number of areas. But going against that more general trend, we saw a continuing stream of rulings on environmental claims and alleged greenwash. And complaints which would previously have been rejected or dealt with informally, we're now seeing those go through to formal rulings. A little later, we'll look at an adjudication hot off the press from today, where in essence, the complaint simply alleged that it was irresponsible to show a Land Rover in a forest. We get the next slide, please. So what are we going to look at today? We're going to run through the new Green Claims Code, which has been published in the last couple of months by the Competition and Markets Authority. And alongside that, we're going to consider the approach of the Advertising Standards Authority, since they apply similar principles. The ASA rulings are public and they're available for us to learn from. We're going to use those ASA adjudications to illustrate the guidance in the Green Claims Code. Now, I'm conscious that we have a lot of different industries in the audience today. And while the principles around the use of green claims are the same, the practical application can be very different. We obviously have to keep the content of this webinar broad, but we have looked to include a very wide range of examples. I think we've got everything from gold mining to dog excrement, and I'd challenge you to go any broader than that. Please do also feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and if you'd be interested in a more bespoke workshop style session focused on your business or your particular industry, then just let us know. So the Green Claims Code, how did this come about? The Competition and Markets Authority, as part of its involvement with ICEPEN, which is an international network of consumer protection enforcement authorities, conducted a website review. So it went out there, looked at a whole bunch of websites, and it assessed the green claims made on those websites to see whether it thought they were likely to be problematic. And what it found was quite startling in a way. So four out of 10 green claims made online, the CMA found, could be misleading consumers. And that's just on the face of those claims. Obviously, the CMA didn't delve into the supporting evidence behind those claims. And the kinds of issues they were finding, so vague claims and unclear language, terms such as eco or sustainable. So, I mean, that's one of the biggest issues for me, that you'll look at green claims content, you'll look at web pages, and it will present the product or the service as a whole as sustainable, and the basis for that will be something much more specific about just one aspect of the product. It found own brand eco logos and labels essentially posing as kite marks, so appearing to be from a third-party organization, but in fact having been created and designed by the advertiser's own creative teams. And it found that businesses were hiding or omitting information, such as a product's pollution levels, to appear more eco-friendly. Now, that's no surprise. That's what marketing teams do. That's what they're there for. They're there to paint the benefits of choosing a particular product. They're not there for, or they haven't in the past been there for, presenting a holistic view of the product, warts and all. And what the Competition and Markets Authority is doing, and what they seem to have found, is starting to challenge that. So the Competition and Markets Authority have come out with the new Green Claims Code. Now, the good news about that is that its content should be quite familiar to you if you're already familiar with the Advertising Standards Authority's rules around green claims, for example. The bad news is that this kind of initiative, where guidance goes out to business, tends to herald a crackdown on more problematic claims. And indeed, that's explicitly what the Competition and Markets Authority have said. So they are to carry out a full review of misleading green claims early in 2022 and stand ready to take action against offending firms. Next slide, please, John. Very briefly, let's run through the status of the Green Claims Code. It's practical guidance. It's very readable. It's chock full of examples. It's well worth taking a look at. but it flows from the underlying laws on misleading advertising and misleading omissions, etc., under the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations or the Business Protection from Misleading Marketing Regulations. So it's there as guidance, but it's underpinned by law. And where a business does not follow the principles, the CMA may have said that those claims are more likely to attract their attention. Undoubtedly, it will also influence the other regulators as to when and where they choose to take enforcement action. So trading standards, for example, and the Advertising Standards Authority. Next slide, please. What is an environmental claim according to the code? Well, it's as you would expect. It's a claim that a product or a service has a positive environmental impact or no impact on the environment, is less damaging than it was before, or is less damaging than the competition. Important to note that environmental claims can appear in any media. So we still have the occasional view that this kind of content is more editorial in nature, it's PR, and therefore it's not subject to regulatory oversight, or it's not within the remit of the Advertising Standards Authority. For most of your businesses, content that you're putting out about sustainability, about environmental performance, is going to be covered either by the Green Claims Code, by laws around misleading advertising, or by the Advertising Standards Authority's codes. And the code covers not just content aimed at consumers, it also covers content aimed at businesses. And again, this is an issue we come across in practice. There's an idea that, and in many cases this is correct, that your marketing, when it's aimed at businesses, is lower risk. You can get away with saying more, it needs less clearance, less oversight, but we have real live experience of campaigning groups going through those sustainability pages on a company's website, which are intended for trade customers, and picking out the more problematic claims and making complaints about them. Other point to note here is that the regulators don't just look at copy, they don't just look at the accuracy of what you're saying, they look at the overall impression that you're giving. And that could be a combination of copy, images, small print, qualifying wording. They look at the substantiation, the supporting evidence that you can provide, and they look at the overall presentation of the ad to see what the average consumer will take from it. Okay, next slide. And what happens if you don't comply? Well, the Competition and Markets Authority and Trading Standards have broad enforcement powers in relation to the underlying law. And on top of that, the government is also consulting on potential additional powers for the Competition and Markets Authority, which may include the power to levy fines without pursuing a business through the courts. So just have that in your mind. The Advertising Standards Authority obviously can take action against misleading advertisements, and businesses may face legal action from consumers, either for breach of the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations, for misrepresentation, for breach of contracts. And you only have to look at the class actions brought against some of the car manufacturers around their claims about diesel fuels to see how burdensome, how badly that can go. Next slide, please. Kate.
Thank you. So what's in the Green Claims Code? The code sets out 6 principles specifying that claims must be truthful and accurate, they must be clear and unambiguous, they must not omit or hide material information, they must only make fair and meaningful comparisons, they must consider the full life cycle of the product or the service, and they must be substantiated. These are practical principles that should help businesses make more compliant environmental claims. The new code doesn't prevent businesses from making truthful environmental claims. Rather, part of the CMA's push in this space is to let brands who can tell substantiated green stories do so, without being drowned out by others who make claims without a basis. As many of you will know, and as Dan just mentioned, these principles are not new, and the ASA has been considering advertisements in this context for many years. We'll take you through each principle now using examples from the ASA's previous adjudications to illustrate the points. Thanks, John. So the first principle, put simply, claims must not contain incorrect information and they must be true. When formulating claims, you should look at the overall impression that it creates and ask yourself whether it might mislead a consumer. A misleading claim might be one that describes or implies that a product is recyclable when only part of that product is, in fact, recyclable. It might be one that claims that a product is organic when it doesn't consist almost entirely of organic components. It might use broad terms such as green, sustainable, and eco-friendly without explanation, and where the product as a whole doesn't have a positive environmental impact or doesn't have no adverse impact. A misleading claim might also be one that is factually true, but doesn't make it clear that the claim only relates to a particular aspect of a product, service, or business, when that product, service, or business has an overall negative impact or otherwise comes at a significant environmental cost. A misleading claim might say, or it might imply, that something is a benefit when it is industry standard or required by law. This might mislead consumers into thinking that the product, service, or business is better than others, when in fact it's just meeting the required standards. If an environmental claim is only true in certain circumstances or if particular conditions apply, then that should be clearly stated. For example, a claim that an electric vehicle produces zero emissions may mislead consumers, but claiming that the car produces zero emissions while driving may not. As usual, this kind of qualifying information should be close enough to the claim so that it's easily seen by the consumer and doesn't contradict the claim being made. So turning to our first example, John, next slide, thank you. So the ASA recently considered Hyundai's claim, a car so beautifully clean, it purifies the air as it goes. The complainant had raised concerns because they understood that although the car wouldn't release exhaust fumes like a traditional combustion engine, it would still release particulates as a result of brake and tyre wear. The ASA held that this claim could be interpreted as meaning that the car had a negligible environmental impact and would in fact remove impurities from the air as it was driven, meaning that no impurities caused by driving remained in the air at all. Hyundai did have an air purification system, but ultimately the ASA found that the claim was misleading because it didn't take into account the fact that particulates from the brakes and the tyres would be released into the air. These kinds of particulates are significant sources of pollution and wouldn't be removed by the car unless they happen to pass through the air filtration system. So the key takeaway from this decision is that even when a product has strong environmental credentials, you should make sure that your claims don't overreach and don't go further than what you can substantiate. Next example, thank you. This example concerns some claims made by Colourful Coffins, which were being made on its website, including, we offer the only 100% recycled cardboard coffin on the market. A complainant challenged whether the claim 100% recycled cardboard was misleading. The ASA considered that as the outer edges of the cardboard weren't recyclable because all cardboard required glue for bonding and it was unlikely that the glue used in the product was also recyclable, this claim could not be supported by evidence and was misleading. So the key thing here is that you shouldn't make a claim or otherwise give the impression that a product is recyclable if it's not, or as the case was here, if only parts of it are and other parts are not, preventing recycling as a whole. Thank you. A few years ago now, Georgia Pacific ran a prize promotion to win Volkswagen camper vans and mountain bikes with the Nuval Soft toilet tissue. The online promotion included the claim, win genuinely green prizes with Nuval Soft. When complaints were made, Georgia Pacific defended the claim on the basis that this van was the most fuel efficient model of its line and had lower emissions than others in its category. The ASA found that because it was not clear that this ad was intended as a comparison with other kinds of camper vans, the claim genuinely green would be understood to mean that the price didn't have a negative impact on the environment, taking into account its whole life cycle, starting from manufacture all the way through to disposal, rather than it had a less negative impact because of its lower emissions than others on the market. And ultimately, this was found to be misleading. So just a key thing to remember is broad claims like green must be supported by clear evidence that the product or service has a positive environmental impact or not a negative one. And without these, the kinds of claims that are made so broadly are likely to be misleading. Over to you, Dan.
Okay, so turning to principle 2, and you'll see as we go through this that there's a lot of overlap between these principles, and many of the examples we could have slotted in against any of the principles, frankly. So here, the principle is be sure that claims are clear and unambiguous. And the code gives examples again of claims which it considers likely to be problematic. And the first of those is again, vague or general statements of environmental benefit. The vaguer you are, the broader your wording is, the more possible interpretations there are, the more likely it is that the Advertising Standards Authority or another regulator will require you to substantiate the most difficult interpretation, to substantiate the broadest interpretation. And therefore, the harder your job defending that claim if a complaint is made to one of those regulators. Another example of a problematic claim here, claims about future goals where the business does not have a clear and verifiable strategy to deliver them. Now, for years, this has been a fallback position for us when looking at green claims. So a business has wanted to make a green claim, has decided that it's not yet quite in the position to make that green claim, so has instead expressed the claim as an aspiration, a step on the journey. We are working towards this. We're not quite there yet, but we're on a journey to delivering it. Now, the new code looks at that and seeks to constrain it because the regulators do not want businesses exploiting that leeway and putting out claims that they are working towards something when they've got no clear and verifiable strategy to deliver it. So the expectation will be, if you say you're on a journey to zero carbon emissions or something along those lines, that you are able to produce the strategy, the documentation, that you are making progress, that there are clear objectives and you are making progress on the way to that ultimate objective, that you are monitoring progress on the way to that ultimate objective. Claims which use confusing or technical language, obviously those can always be ambiguous, difficult for consumers to understand. In particular, you might have more flexibility with a trade audience. And some of the issues in this space, so carbon neutral claims, for example, can be very technical. So there is a bit of a skill there in getting all the information which the consumer needs across to the consumer in a way in which they understand, but balancing against the risk of generalizing too much and thereby misleading the consumer. And really the biggest piece of advice here is be specific. And there's always a tension with marketing teams on this. They want to reach for consumer-friendly language. They want to reach for hard-hitting headlines, but actually the regulators are pushing in the opposite direction. They are very much encouraging you to look at making much more specific, detailed claims. So looking at a couple of examples here. So we've got a bus ad for Alpro from late 2020. The adjudication on this was last month. And this is something we're also seeing with the Advertising Standards Authority at the moment, that they're taking up to 12 months to consider these more complex environmental claims issues. You can see that that Alpro ad is saying, next stop, your recipe to a healthier planet, good for the planet, good for you. So easy to spot the issue there, good for the planet. So the complainant believed that commercial almond farming for almond milk was environmentally damaging. Now, Alpro were able to rebut that specific complaint. They were able to establish that they sourced their almonds in a different way from regions which didn't present the same environmental issues. But the complaint was still upheld. And that was because even though Alpro had some evidence to support some of their products' environmental impacts across their life cycle, it didn't have anything which could support good for the planet, which the ASA interpreted as meaning that the Alpro products featured had a net positive environmental benefit for the planet across their whole life cycle. That's a very difficult claim to substantiate, and Alpro weren't able to achieve that. Next one was Quorn. So this is a TV ad for Quorn Thai Wonder Grains, again from last year. So the voiceover here said, "I care about climate change and I love my food. So new Quorn Thai Wonder Grains is a step in the right direction because it helps us reduce our carbon footprint, and that's got to be good. If you care about climate change, take a step in the right direction with new Quorn Wonder Grains." And then there was on-screen text referring to the fact that Quorn Wonder Grains had been awarded carbon reduction footprint certification by the Carbon Trust for their full life cycle. Now, the carbon reduction footprint certification did relate to the full life cycle of the products, so that met one of the standards that the ASA was expecting. However, what Quorn was really talking about here was that they'd established an initial benchmark with the Carbon Trust and that they were committed to reducing their environmental footprint over time. And they had the plan to show that they would do that. Now, the Advertising Standards Authority looked at this and said, no, the average consumer would interpret this as a claim that simply by buying the product right now, and not by continuing gradually to buy it over time, they would reduce their carbon footprint as compared to competitor products. That wasn't Quorn's intention, but the claim was ambiguous, and therefore the ASA found it to be misleading on what the ASA considered the average consumer's interpretation of the wording would be. Next one from a very different industry, gold mining. So this is Dalradian Gold, and they were in the planning process for introducing a new gold mine in Northern Ireland, and part of the materials they circulated said 100% carbon neutral from day one. The mine will not contribute to climate change. Quite a big claim, but the ASA looked at the evidence that Dalradian Gold had, and they were able to put across detailed plans to assess the emissions impact across the whole life cycle of the mine, from construction through to shutdown, applying the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an emission standard which tends to be accepted by the Advertising Standards Authority, plans to reduce their direct and indirect emissions and to offset the remainder of those emissions. The Advertising Standards Authority concluded that the ad was not likely to mislead. Dalradian Gold were not simply making ambiguous or vague claims about future goals. They had a clear and verifiable strategy to deliver those goals. Two more on this, very quickly. Stovax, wood-burning stove, burn clean is the headline. The Advertising Standards Authority considered that in context, burn clean was not ambiguous because it was clearly linked to the regulatory standards set out in the Clean Air Act. So Stovax were okay on that score. Hybrid vehicles, big area for complaints. People tend to assume that manufacturers are overstating the electrification of hybrid vehicles. This ad, what is the new Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrid? It's electric, it's electric, it's electric, it's electric. That repeated phrase caused people to complain, to say that Mitsubishi were exaggerating the electrification. The Advertising Standards Authority said, no, in this case, this ad is not misleading, it's not ambiguous, it specifically also refers to petrol power and miles per gallon. So it's clear to consumers that this car is using not only electric power, but also more conventional fuels. And then last one on this section, where the ruling did go against the advertiser. So this was a customer testimonial. It was customer content on social media, and the lady in question was talking about her BMW i3 and the benefits of it. And as part of that, she said, and it helps to give back to the environment. BMW adopted this content. They put it out on their own platforms. And frankly, the Advertising Standards Authority would have considered them to have adopted it, even if they'd only retweeted it or engaged with it in some way. The Advertising Standards Authority essentially said, all cars come at an environmental cost. No cars help to give back to the environment. This would be interpreted as an objective claim, even though it's within the context of a customer testimonial. It's not clearly a comparative claim against petrol or diesel fueled cars. It's an absolute claim, and therefore it is misleading. Kate.
All right, so principle 3. Claims must not omit or hide information that consumers need to make informed transactional choices. Consumers will take into account a range of factors when deciding whether or not to buy a good or a service, and you should make sure that you include all of the information that those consumers need to make that informed choice. If a piece of information would change the overall message of your claim, that would likely be deceptive to not include that information at the outset. This is increasingly important as consumers become more conscious of the environmental impact of what they consume and are demanding that products and services have a positive effect on or minimise harm to the environment. Naturally, there is an attraction for businesses to promote their environmental credentials, but this must be justified. So a few examples of what might be problematic claims in this area. It's likely to be problematic for a claim to cherry pick the positive environmental aspects of a product where other aspects are more negative. This is especially the case when the benefits claimed only relate to a relatively minor aspect of that product or service, or only relate to part of a brand's activities. Cherry picking information will likely make consumers think that that product, service, or brand is greener than it really is, which, if not supported, risks being misleading. It may also be misleading, but carbon neutral claims don't clarify whether carbon neutrality is based on a reduction of carbon emissions or the offsetting of those emissions. Carbon neutral claims are highly technical claims based on a life cycle assessment of the relevant product. Carbon neutrality is typically achieved through a combination of reducing emissions attributable to that product and then offsetting the remaining emissions through a recognised scheme. The ASA's guidance on this is currently being reviewed and reworked, so it's something of a grey area at the moment. But pending publication of that revised guidance, our recommendation would be to err on the side of including more information rather than less, including information about the limitations of any life cycle assessment. You should also specifically and explicitly clarify to the consumer that carbon neutrality involves both the reduction and offsetting of emissions. When you include qualifying information, it must be prominent, easily accessible, and easily understood. The further away this information appears, the more likely the claim it relates to will be seen as misleading. And don't forget that space limitations will not be a defence for not providing that important information about environmental impacts. It may be that some mediums are just not as well suited for these kind of claims. First example, thanks, John. So Shell ran this radio ad early last year, and a number of complaints were submitted to the ASA contending that the claim right at the end, drive carbon neutral, was misleading by omission. The ASA found that this ad gave consumers the impression that they could visit a petrol station and fill up with fuel that was carbon neutral, but it wasn't that simple. Shell Go Plus was a loyalty program. After signing up, membership card holders needed to log their fuel purchases. The carbon associated with that fuel was then offset by Shell through a third-party verification process. While the ASA did not think that the radio ad needed to include a full explanation of the scheme, it did find that the fact that there was nothing at all in the ad indicating that Shell was advertising a loyalty scheme was misleading by omission. So always remember that while ads don't need to include all of the information up front, they need to include the information that is most significant and include a signpost to where fuller details can be found. Back to you, Dan.
Okay, so principle 4 is around comparisons, comparative advertising. Excuse me, only make fair and meaningful comparisons. And this is whether you're comparing with your own earlier versions of the product or a competitor's products. You need to ensure the comparisons are not misleading. As part of that, you should avoid hanging comparisons. So saying something is greener might be easier to prove than saying it's green, absolutely. But greener than what? If you don't say, then again, a regulator could adopt an interpretation which you didn't intend. So if you say your recyclable packaging is greener, meaning that it was greener than the previous non-recyclable version of that packaging, well, you might be able to evidence that, you might be able to substantiate that. But if you simply say it's greener without clarifying that the comparison is with the earlier version of that packaging, then the assumption might be that you're saying it's greener than competitor packaging or competitor recyclable packaging, which you may not be able to prove. Usual rules around comparative advertising apply, so you need to avoid misleading, to compare products meeting the same needs or intended for the same purpose, compare representative features, etc., etc. You might choose to compare CO2 emissions. In that case, you will need to ensure that the calculation is performed in the same way for each product and relate to the whole life cycle, or are clearly limited to the same part of the life cycle. You need to ensure that the comparison you're making is representative and verifiable, so you couldn't just cherry pick the part of the life cycle which is most favorable to your own product. And as with all comparative advertising, and especially in this particular sensitive area, it's likely to be contentious. So you need to be very confident that your advertising will stand up to the scrutiny given to it by your competitors and their legal team. Of course, if you're using a competitor brand, there's also the possibility of trademark infringement. Just one example on this. So Ryanair claimed to be the lowest emissions major airline. There were various complaints about that, and the Advertising Standards Authority upheld those complaints as misleading and considered the advert to be misleading on a couple of grounds. So firstly, Ryanair had not included within the comparison all the airlines which the ASA considered the average consumer would believe fell within the definition major airlines. And secondly, the Advertising Standards Authority disagreed with the technical basis for calculation, as it did not assess the impact of seating density within the planes. They went on to say that the basis for the calculations was not made sufficiently clear in the ads.
Principle number 5, substantiation. Most environmental claims are likely to be seen as objective claims that can be tested against evidence. Accordingly, they must be supported by robust, credible, relevant, and up-to-date scientific or other evidence. You should make sure that you hold this evidence before you proceed to make an environmental claim. If a complaint is made to a regulator, then they will almost certainly ask that you provide the evidence that supports the relevant claim. Broader and more ambitious claims may be more difficult to substantiate. For example, a claim that a product is environmentally friendly may refer to a number of environmental aspects, such as its impacts on the air, the soil and water, its packaging, its components, and the production processes used, how it is used by consumers, and how it's disposed of. Describing a product as environmentally friendly is likely to suggest that the product has an overall positive impact on the environment or no negative one. If you make this kind of broad claim, then you will need a very high level of strong evidence that supports it. Similarly, with carbon neutral claims, you may well need independent certification covering the reduction of emissions through the supply chain, its manufacturing processes, if there are any indirect emissions, distribution, use and disposal. You would also need evidence of the offsetting schemes you are using based on recognised standards, which must be capable of objective verification. Where a claim is not based on accepted science or other evidence, then it will be very difficult to substantiate, and it is more likely to be misleading to do so. Similarly, if you're not using evidence that is based on real world experience, but rather the results of lab testing or results that can only be replicated in very specific circumstances, then the claim could be misleading unless those limitations are explained. So turning to our example, thanks, John. So here we go, it was foreshadowed at the outset. Ancole's webpage included text that stated, refill poop bag rolls. These thick waste bags are biodegradable to lessen your dog's impact on the environment. The ASA thought that consumers would assume that they could dispose of these bags in the usual ways. So for example, in bins that are specifically provided for the purpose of dog waste disposal in parks. And by swapping conventional plastic bags for these bags, consumers could in turn reduce their impact on the environment. The ASA consulted with the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, as well as other experts, and concluded that in order to be described as biodegradable, plastic needed to biodegrade significantly faster than its equivalent, the conventional plastic equivalent. The ASA found evidence that didn't support that the biodegradable process would be quicker for these Ancole bags, and so concluded that this claim was misleading. Back to you, Dan.
Okay, so the last principle, which we've hinted at elsewhere in the talk already, consider the full life cycle of the product. So it's clear that the code is encouraging businesses to look at the impact of their products or services end to end on a cradle to grave basis. However, the code does give some comfort that it will still be possible in some circumstances to focus in on parts of the life cycle where that's clearly explained. So for example, the code talks about electric cars making zero emissions claims. Now, an electric car is not zero emissions. There are emissions associated with its manufacture. There are emissions associated with electricity generation to power the vehicle. However, the code indicates, and this is the sort of accepted wisdom before the Advertising Standards Authority, that if you qualify those claims with while driving, i.e. you focus in on a particular part of the life cycle, they're likely to be okay. It's also very clear from the complaints we have with the ASA on our desks right now that the ASA is continuing to accept that you can make claims in relation to parts of a product life cycle so long as you make it clear that that's what you're doing. Other things which might be problematic here, very specific claims which mislead consumers about the total environmental impact. So I've already encouraged you to be very specific in your formulation of these claims, but if you're focusing in on something very minor, then there is the potential to give a misleading overall impression about the product as a whole. I've seen some ads recently which have talked about sustainable touches in the context of a much bigger product. That rings alarm bells. If you're focusing in on something tiny, when your product as a whole is likely to be polluting, then you may still be misleading. Let's look at just one example on this. So again, it falls into the category of claims which really were too general or were more general than the advertiser intended. So here Arla said that their organic milk was good for the land. They intended by that to refer to organic farming methods and the use of renewable sources and the protection of non-renewable sources on the relevant farmland. But they didn't qualify the claim in that way. And therefore, the Advertising Standards Authority looked at the whole life cycle and said, well, we would consider good for the land to mean an overall beneficial impact on the environment across the whole product life cycle. And you, Arla, have not provided the evidence to support that interpretation of the claim.
So now turning to the ASA just very briefly, it's not surprising that they are also considering some updates and some next steps. So as part of their Ad Net Zero campaign, the ASA are encouraging the ad industry to promote more sustainable messages in their advertising and have made it clear that they will take a tough line on misleading environmental ads. They're also going to be taking stock of how effective the advertising rules are in governing environmental claims. They've also announced that they are looking to update their guidance. So they're finalising guidance, which will set out the key principles to ensure that ads don't mislead consumers about the environment and ensure that these ads are socially responsible and tackle current issues. There will also be some new guidance, which is due next spring. They have also said that they will conduct inquiries into specific issues where urgent carbon reduction is required. The priority areas will include aviation, cars, waste, animal-based foods, and heating. The ASA's focus will be on making sure they make the right decisions, listen to consumer and industry concerns, and offer helpful guidance to advertisers. They are also commissioning research into consumer understanding of carbon neutral and net zero claims, as well as research into consumer perceptions of hybrid claims in the electric vehicle market. It's fair to say that the ASA is in some flux at the moment, and we will likely know some more once the new guidance has been published in the coming months. It's clear that environmental claims will be heavily scrutinised by both the CMA and the ASA moving forward, which makes it only all the more imperative that businesses keep a close eye on regulatory developments and take additional care when making claims. Dan?
So before we finish, I just wanted to briefly touch on this, which is a ruling from today on Jaguar Land Rover. And we've already seen from a lot of the examples that in many cases, the issue here is not the business simply confecting green claims where it has no green or environmental story to tell. In most cases, it's a case of there being an environmental story to tell, but the claim being too general, the business overreaching. Here we see that even advertising which doesn't attempt to make any green claims can still be caught up in complaints. So this is a Land Rover in a forest. We've seen similar advertising many, many times before. And in this case, however, a campaigning group decided to make complaints about this particular ad, presumably because they objected to the idea that high emissions vehicles or vehicles depicted as having higher emissions should not really be advertised at all these days. That's presumably their objection. And they put in some complaints which weren't really based on the codes in any real sense. They argued that life is so much better without restrictions, which was intended as a nod to the end of COVID restrictions. The end of lockdown was about being free to ignore good practice and rules around environmental climate issues. And they said that it's irresponsible to show people using a Land Rover in a forest. It might encourage them to go out to ecologically sensitive areas. Now, the Advertising Standards Authority did not uphold these complaints. However, it is worth noting that the complaints were made. So particularly if you're operating in this kind of space and you're responsible for products or services which are typically associated or thought to be environmentally damaging or thought to be environmentally damaging by particular campaigners, you may well be on the receiving end of any advertising you put out on the grounds that it's irresponsible. Secondly, that the Advertising Standards Authority in time gone by would have dismissed these complaints as not being sufficiently well thought out. Whereas here, this has gone through to a formal ruling. So the ASA is feeling under pressure, and we're likely to see more rulings of this nature around responsibility and green issues in advertising. So just to finish with some tips, really all I want to say here, the overriding points are be specific in your claims and be mindful of the overriding environmental impacts of your products and services. It might make your claim wording awkward, it might be resisted by your marketing teams, but it could save you an enormous amount of hassle along with brand and reputational damage as the regulators crack down.
Thank you, Dan. Kate. We have some time for questions, and I have to say, if you want to add to the string of questions already coming, please do so, because we all like to hear from the people who are participating wherever you are today. So please do put them in on the Q&A, which should be on your screen. And while I've got your attention, I should also just say that there will be a feedback form that will come to you at the as you log out of this webinar. We would be really grateful if you could fill that in, partly if you've got any other follow-up questions, but also if you've got any other comments either about how we did today, but also about future webinars that we will be doing in future. For those of you who participated last year, we did have a series of webinars, and we're planning on doing that again this year. So if there's any topics that are particularly of interest to you, then let us know, because we would love to keep it as relevant as possible to you. Now, question number one, everybody. What process should be adopted when seeking to make a complaint to the CMA or ASA? And actually, I've had another observation from somebody else that I'll weave in here, which is also that if you're in the financial services industry, then the FCA also looks at this sort of issue. So there's a lot of different organisations looking at these issues. So it's very relevant, probably whatever sector you're in. Now, so the question was, what process should you adopt? But I'll just read the rest of the question, because it's all relevant. Is it necessary for the complaint to be made direct to the alleged offender first before submitting this to the relevant authority? And are complaints anonymous? So, Dan, do you want to go first on that one? Or?
So firstly, with the different regulators, so the Competition and Markets Authority, as you would get from its name, tends to look at issues on a market level. So it will go after individual businesses, but it tends to look at sectors more generally, consider issues which are endemic in the marketplace. And that's the approach that I would expect it to adopt sector by sector next year. There is a bit of a grace period, essentially. So the Competition and Markets Authority has said that that crackdown, that enforcement process will begin next year. In the meantime, you might have difficulties with the Advertising Standards Authority or another regulator. But if you were putting in a complaint, then it's really, I guess, seeking to ensure that the Competition and Markets Authority have those particular issues on their radar when they come to look at that particular sector. If you are complaining to the Advertising Standards Authority, let's say about a competitor or a business, so you're not complaining as an individual, then you are obliged to put a letter into the advertiser, the other party first, and to give them a working week to respond. And if they don't respond satisfactorily, then you can put your complaint in to the Advertising Standards Authority. You cannot put a complaint into, or you are not supposed to put a complaint into the Advertising Standards Authority anonymously, where you represent a business in the space, so a competitor, or you are part of a campaigning group or something like that. If you are a genuine consumer, if you're an individual, then you are essentially anonymous through the complaint process. And that can be abused. So certainly there have been cases of businesses asking their employees to put in complaints as if they were individual consumers. That's sharp practice. The Advertising Standards Authority, if it has any doubts on that score, may well ask the individual to sign something to confirm that they are not employed by a competing business.
Pretty complete. The process. Pretty complete. And maybe you'd like to answer this next question. We've got a question which is, what sort of consequences would we like to see for companies from, it says successful court claims brought by the CMA or trading standards? I don't know if you want to go to that, or whether you want to talk more generally about consequences of doing this stuff wrong.
Sure. So consequences of the court proceedings or from the CMA generally, they can issue fines. There could be cost orders levied against you. I guess we haven't seen it yet, what they're likely to do in this space for breaches of the Green Claims Code. But generally speaking, they do try and treat fines and penalties as a deterrent, so that others in the industry and others who are making green claims, as it will be in this case, don't go off and continue to flout the rules. Anything else to add, Dan?
I mean, I guess we should say that technically, under the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations, there are offences by bodies corporate, but they are also misleading advertising under those regulations is also there are potential offences by officers of the company who connived or consented to that activity or to whose neglect it's attributable. Now, that kind of action is likely to be reserved for the most severe circumstances, but nevertheless that power exists. You've also got the issue, of course, that even if it's just to the ASA, who have lesser powers, essentially rely on the negative publicity associated with publishing an upheld ruling. Do you really want the brand and reputational damage which goes with being painted as greenwashing at this time, in this environment, in the context of this consumer and media concern?
Thanks, Dan. I was going to wrap up there, but we keep putting more questions in, and this one's great. Well, they're all great, by the way, everybody. The next question is, if products or services have green in the product or service name, and those products don't have a beneficial impact or the required level of impact to be in accordance with the code on the environment, should businesses consider changing the actual product or service name?
That's interesting, and that would depend on, we'd need to see more detail on that. So just plucking one out of the air, if you take something like Green Flag, well, the colour green in their name is because their brand colours are green, and they have a green flag. So unlikely to be an issue there. But if you have a brand name which is clearly directed at environment, a claim to being environmentally friendly, or when placed in the context of the copy which would surround it amounts to an environmental claim, then yes, there is the possibility of action from the regulators there. And we've seen that, I've not seen an example in this context yet, but it's certainly a possibility. But we've certainly seen it in the context of health and beauty claims, for example, where products make a claim about a particular health benefit within the name of the product. Certainly, those kind of products have been cracked down on in the past. So absolutely, I could see the potential for issues with brand or product names.
Thanks, Dan. We are coming up to the hour, but there's one final question. If you can answer it in a couple of sentences, please. We mentioned that it's business to business as well as business to consumer, but most examples we shared were ads. So does it apply to business claims in terms of things like bids for projects, supply chain presentations, sort of almost a one-on-one business to business stuff? Yeah,
and take your point. We illustrated the examples with advertising. The examples were taken from the Advertising Standards Authority, and the Advertising Standards Authority does consider business to business claims and complaints, but the majority of its work is in the consumer space. Nevertheless, a lot of the issues would also apply in a business-to-business context. The Advertising Standards Authority wouldn't necessarily have remit, though it would in a website context, so that's where we see it come up most often. You also have potential issues around misrepresentation, breach of contracts, those kind of issues which might come up where you're making green claims in a more sort of direct to a particular business customer sales context, which might fall outside the ASA's remit. You've also got scenarios where you're putting out material, press releases, etc., which would fall outside of the ASA's remit, but would still fall within trading standards remit. Now, the likelihood of trading standards prioritizing action in a business-to-business context, that may be more limited, but nevertheless, the possibility exists. You've also got the possibility of simply a backlash. So brand and reputational issues, a campaigning organization, simply pointing out that the claims you're making are misleading.
Thanks, Dan. I think we'll have to leave it there because we have to slightly run over by 1 minute. But thank you everybody for joining us. Please to fill in that feedback, please, and let us know what you thought both in relation to this and in relation to anything you'd like us to do in future. And thank you again for joining us. See you next time.
Thank you.